Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Wednesday Zoom conference of Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, where today we're going to have one of our members, Paul Koch, who will be talking about his memories and his involvement in the Stockholm Conference of 1972. Go ahead, Paul.
Thanks very much, Art. It's a pleasure to do this. What I'm going to try and do is give the presentation in approximately 1/2 hour, and then allow lots of time for questions and discussion. And hopefully everybody can see the first slide at this point. Is it up there, Art?
Yes, let's go ahead.
Okay. So away we go. I showed Art my report one day, or told him about it, and that's how this happened. He said, would I please send it to him? So I did, and then he suggested that we have this presentation. So I put it together. It's all about Only One Earth in the Stockholm Conference, which was an alarm clock for the world. For those of you, most of you, I feel a little bit like I'm taking coals to Newcastle today, because I know a lot of you, if you weren't there, know a lot about the Stockholm Conference and much of what's happened since. But assuming you don't know anything, I'll go through things and bring everybody up to date. So the whole environmental thing really started with Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, in 1962, talking about the indiscriminate use of pesticides, DDT being a very specific one. And then the UN General Assembly in '68 called for this conference with the aim of producing an international consensus on ways of preserving and improving the Earth's environment for this and future generations. And here's where the Club of Rome comes in, because Dr. Aurelio Pacheco, one of the co-founders, I believe, of the Club of Rome, got together 30 individuals from 10 countries, and they discussed what they should be doing about it. And that led to the formation of the Club of Rome and the publication of the 1972 of the Limits to Growth. And Morris Strong, who many of you know his history, it's an incredible history, but he was asked to guide the preparatory work for the conference. And they produced a draft declaration on the human environment and an action plan for the human environment. The two books that were available for the conference were, of course, the Koch book, not the Koch book, the Club of Rome's book, done by the Meadows and others, The Limits to Growth, which was a very controversial book at its time. And in some people's minds, it still remains controversial, but I do think it's done a tremendous job to the world in terms of leading the discussion and the thinking. And then Morris Strong asked Barbara Ward and Rene Dubois to produce this book, Only One Earth, the Care and Maintenance of a Small Planet. I have copies of both those books here. If you haven't read them, it might be something you want to do sometime. Just quickly, the Stockholm Conference, I pulled this off the internet, was referred to as the Stockholm Conference, took place in June '72 from the 5th to the 16th, and addressed very simply the issues to create a plan for environmental action, recommendations for international actions, and educational, informational, social, and cultural ties to the environmental issue. Now, I think I should just say a word about how I got there. I was a Waterloo Engineering Co-op student who went and worked at Procter & Gamble on my co-op terms in Hamilton. And I must say, P&G is a very reputable company, but I was appalled when I saw what they were dumping into the Hamilton Harbor. Not only P&G, but Firestone Tire, International Harvester. The city of Hamilton was still dumping a lot of its raw sewage into the Hamilton Harbor. I'd go down there at lunchtime and see the dead fish floating around, and that wasn't the only thing you'd see floating around. But I joined P&G in 1964, and I'd grown up going to the Guelph YMCA, And I got asked to get involved in some fundraising to start up the Burlington Family Y, and that led to a long association I had with the Y, where I was president of the Burlington Y, member of the Metro Hamilton Y, and the regional VP for the National Council. In '68, I resigned from P&G and joined IBM. And that happened because I raised so much money for the Burlington Y that the gentleman from London Life came and said he wanted me to come and become an agent for London Life. Well, with my technical background and whatnot, I thought if I was going to be in marketing, I didn't want to sell life insurance, but I ended up going to IBM. Because Morris Strong had been the past president of the Canadian Y, and I'd come to know him to some degree, not very well, and had become Secretary General of the conference, he wanted the YMCA to send a delegation to Stockholm. So we had the then president of the Y send a letter to IBM, and they gave me $2,000 and 2 weeks off, and away I went. Why did the YMCA want to be there? Well, the UN Charter details ways of cooperation between UN systems and NGOs. And this resulted in the encouragement of NGOs to send delegations to Stockholm and contribute to the discussions. At the time, in the United States, there was a Center for International Management Studies, CIMS, of the YMCA, and they were connected to 86 countries around the world. And Morris Strong really was encouraging to have that involvement. And so the CIMS sent an international delegation to meet in Scanticon in Aarhus, Denmark for 4 days to prepare. And that was at Scanticon at the time was an engineering medical think tank place where they had professional activities. So away we went. We had 25 YMCA staff members, 3 from Canada, myself, Ernest Griffith from the Toronto Harbor Commission, and Don McGregor from the National Y staff. And then we had industrial representatives from Switzerland and the USA, environmental planning people, quite a host of good people who were reasonably senior. And it was a real collection of knowledge and lack of knowledge on the subject at the time of environment. We reviewed the planned program for Stockholm and the material available. Example, I have here the Stockholm and Beyond report from the United States government, and we became acquainted with each other and our backgrounds and interests, and we identified resources that we could put to use when we got to Stockholm. Now, I will read these because there's really no other option. There's 6 major areas addressed at Stockholm: the planning and management of human settlements for environmental quality, environmental aspects of natural resource management, identification and control of pollutants and nuisances of broad international significance, educational, informational, social, and cultural aspects of environmental problems, development and the environment, and finally, institutional arrangements and the Declaration on the Human Environment, which have been written in preparation for the conference with the hope that it would be approved. The opening of the conference was at the beautiful Stockholm Cathedral. It was very moving, and Morris Strong's wife gave the address, and she made this point about producing more changes in one generation than natural systems in the world in which our life and well-being depend, and in the whole of previous history. And there's the literal truth. Words of the poet, that to touch a flower is to stir a star. And knowing it demands a new view of the cause and effect relationships of human action and reaction in every sphere. And modern technology forcing us to come to grips with ancient religious truths. And we've then laid down to rest forever the fallacy that unrestrained private pursuit of private greed will serve the larger interests of society as a whole. And it's really that statement by Mrs. Strong that we've all been struggling with ever since. The Environmental Forum, key to Stockholm and the success that it had, was the Environmental Forum, which was the brainchild of Morris Strong, and this allowed grassroots input to the conference. The objectives of it was to stimulate discussions on environmental problems in order to promote deeper and wider understanding of the problems, to uncover causes behind the crisis and give priority to social economic factors, and mobilize as broad a front as possible to deal with environmental issues. Now, just like today, the Environmental Forum, there was concern there would be even violence there because there were quite a number of people came with axes to grind of one type or another. At the time, the Vietnam War was in play and there's a lot of defoliation going on, of course. But fortunately, there was no violence. And this forum took place primarily at the Arts College in Stockholm. And I attended quite a few events. 2 of our 25 representatives had official status at the conference, so they could go to all of the speeches and sit in on any of the activities that they wished, as far as I know. The rest of us were able to go to the forum, to attend various speeches that were open to the public and so on. It was very, very interesting. Morris Strong apparently flew to India to specifically talk Indira Gandhi into coming and addressing the conference, and I attended her address, and it likewise was very moving. You can see her at the podium, and in the front row you can see Morris Strong sitting there. Our YMCA delegation met every evening at our hotel in the Grand, at our hotel office in the Grand Hotel to share our experiences and listen to invited visitors and plan for the next day. As part of the planning, we knew what was going on the next day, so we would assign various members of our delegation to attend various activities and report back. That's the list of people who came as guests to our evening events. And one of the great thrills I had was going in a taxi cab and picking up Dr. Margaret Mead and hosting her for the evening and then taking her back to her hotel afterwards. And of course, she was a great anthropologist and wrote a very influential book and other things. There was, of course, a lot of US people involved in the conference, and John Lambert, I'm not sure if he was US or not, but he was the editor of the Forum, which was the daily newspaper put out during the conference. At one time, I had all the copies of those forums, but I think at some point I managed to maybe regretfully get rid of them to save space for other things. What did the NGO activities accomplish? Well, amazingly, 4,000 people from over 155 organizations discussed the problems that the world was facing. People from industrialized nations and developing nations got together to talk and understand what the others were thinking and what they thought the action should be. There became a recognition that a single act by a single nation could have repercussions around the world, and a lot of formal and informal communication networks were established. The role of the Canadian government, of course, Morris Strong, as Secretary, Canada played a very, very major role. And there were daily briefings regarding what was happening within the UN conference. Canada promoted the concept that all natural resources which are renewable should be maintained for optimum sustainable yield. Canada proposed an international register of clean rivers that was adopted by the conference. When I Googled on that, I'm not sure if it still exists or if it exists in another name, but it didn't show up for me anyway as International Register of Clean Rivers. And as often happens, Canada, somebody had to mediate between the Chinese and the United States. What's changed? And in this case, Canada did in order to get approval of the Declaration on the Human Environment. Now, the post-Stockholm developments were later that year, the UNEP, United Nations Environment Program, was established in Nairobi, Kenya, and Morris Strong became its first director. In '87, the publication of Our Common Future happened. Excuse me. And here's the book. If you never read it, it's a good book to read. And it was published by the World Commission on Environment and Development, and the term sustainable development, which we've been using ever since, has took its place, ensuring that development meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. In '92, the UN Conference on Environment and Development took place in Rio, and out of it came the agreement on the Convention on Climate Change and a process to produce a convention on desertification, as we know it as Agenda 21. And still today, UNEP continues to operate from its base in Nairobi. Now, I want to comment on the personal impact of Stockholm on myself. My wife and I had planned to have 2 children and already had them. They were born in '67 and '69. And we were planning 2 more. But the single most important thing that came out of Stockholm in my mind, I think in a lot of people's mind, was that zero population growth was an overriding message from Stockholm. I came home and told Marilyn that the other 2 children we were planning on having were not to be. She's never forgiven me on some days, and other days she's glad that we didn't have them. But that was a really overriding thing out of Stockholm. In '72 to '80, working in Hamilton, Sarnia, and Toronto, I volunteered with the YMCA on environmental initiatives. And in 1980, we moved to Ottawa. And I will say that when I lived in Sarnia, I was responsible for Chemical Valley for IBM. And I had the worst post-nasal drip the 3.5 years we lived in Sarnia that I could imagine. And when we moved to Toronto, it disappeared. So I can only assume in retrospect that that post-nasal drip was caused by some of the chemicals in the air in Sarnia. I hope they've resolved some of those problems. I took early retirement in '92 from IBM when they offered an early buyout to anybody who was going to be 55 by the time 2 years passed by or had more than 25 years of service. And it turned out I was about to turn 53. I had 23 years of service and I qualified, and away I went to pursue my environmental interests. I flew to Vancouver to attend Globe 92. I'm sure some of you people were at Globe 92 and maybe some of the subsequent ones. I wanted to go to Rio, but realized that unless I could find a sponsor, I didn't mind paying to go myself. But because of Stockholm, I knew that if I was in Rio and didn't have any connection to some formal organization or some way to get into events, that it would be a waste of time. So I did not go to Rio. I did establish a small environmental consulting practice, Sustainable Strategies, where I did a variety of projects for Industry Canada, Environment Canada, and the City of Ottawa. One of them I have here, I pulled out the renewal of the Canadian Environmental Industry Strategy. This was in 1997 on behalf of the Canadian Environmental Industry Association and the Canadian Environmental Industry Strategy Implementation Steering Committee. I've lost track of what happened, all of that stuff, but there were some things came out of it. Some of you will remember the Bhopal disaster in India. And out of that in Canada was formed an organization called MIAC, the Major Industrial Accident Council of Canada, and developed the funding and marketing strategy for them. MIAC no longer exists. I must admit, I don't know why it died in the end exactly, but sometime between the year 2000 and 2010, I think it did. And then I was involved with helping Claude Bennett with developing the environmental strategy for the City of Ottawa's amalgamation in 1999-2000. And out of that, we founded Enviro Center, and out of Enviro Center and some of the involvements there, we created the Ottawa Sustainability Fund with the Community Foundation, which still exists and is now managed by Enviro Center. So over the past few years, but I must admit now I'm only a cheerleader, but anybody can pick my brain if they'd like for what's left. And I have participated in a variety of environmental initiatives in Ottawa, Cambridge, and Waterloo. One in Cambridge is I was a founding board member of Canada's largest urban fully protected green space called RARE, which is at the confluence of the Speed and the Grand River. This document, or this chart, I think really came originally from the Club of Rome's work. But incredibly, when you look at it and the time frame on it, you see that here we are in 2020, just about the time that the COVID virus has hit us. And people are really wondering what's going to happen and where it's going to lead. Nobody really knows. But that diagram tells a lot. And the COVID, going back to Stockholm, where population and balancing population and production and the use of resources is the key thing. There are really only three ways to manage population. One is wars, two is pandemics, and three is by good family planning. And the Chinese tried their one-child policy, but that wasn't very good because apparently they aborted most of the females and ended up with a lot of frustrated males. So the world needs to figure out a good way to manage population and production and the use of resources if this planet is going to survive with happy human beings beyond a few more years. With that, in looking at that chart, I found this thing called the EARTHBOUND report on Google, a gentleman named Jeremy Williams, which I had not run into before. If you Google on that, there's a lot of interesting things there, which is why I added that. And finally, I couldn't resist. The copy you see won't have this final chart. Before we turn it back to Art and have some questions and discussion, who knows why the moose ended up in our swimming pool, but there she is. I'm sure most of you saw it on TV or somewhere. And that may have to do with the COVID virus cutting the traffic so much that we've had more animals in our yard this year. She had to jump over 2 5.5-foot fences in order to get into our yard, try to walk on our overnight solar blanket, and fell into the pool. So that's the end of my presentation, a little less than half an hour, and we can do Q&A, and I'm sure some of the people in the audience can give better answers to some of the questions that will be asked than I may be able to. So feel to speak up.
Okay, thank you, Paul. We have right now two members. Anitra will go first, and then Vic will follow after. Anitra, go ahead.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes. No, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
All right. I just wanted to say two things. The Rio conference, for which I held in Miami, the women's preparatory meeting. So we had 3,000 women from all over the world converge and talk about Rio and the sustainability. And one of the real ways in which population can be controlled is to educate women beyond the 4th grade. There's a dramatic shift in population once the women have enough skill sets to be able to be marketable and also have enough security for their old age other than falling back on their children. So women's education is one of the real solutions. Our member, Norman Borlaug, perhaps gave an anti-solution for the population, and that was that he made wheat 4 times more productive. But he said very clearly when he did so and received his Nobel Prize that he was doing this so the world would have 20 years or so to plan for population, which was going to be the big problem. Mamfella can talk about education much better than I in Africa, which is there at least 100 million youth who are out of the educational system, including predominance of females. And for whom skills and a good future is not particularly going to occur. And 20% of the population of Africa is below 50%. So Rio was a mixed bag. And you were probably lucky that you weren't there. It was much more raucous, I think, than Stockholm. But we did have a lot of other members besides the Meadows and Jay Forrester and Margaret Mead. USACOR did. And so I thank you for remembering Margaret, because she was indeed a leader. And we all cherish her remembrance. Thank you.
Any comments,
Yeah,
Paul?
she was quite the lady to spend an evening with. It just very, very outgoing and competent. And of course, I was pretty young at the time, and I'd never read her book, although I read it afterwards. But
Didn't brook fools lightly. He was the general on the hill all the time.
Anitra, can you address whether we still have a clean river registry that Paul had mentioned?
Yeah, I think we do, but I'm not sure that it's very useful anymore. I think, you know, they have a lot of elements. I know in Wisconsin, going into Lake Superior as well as into the Mississippi, they rank all of their rivers in terms of cleanliness and national rivers and so forth and so on. But in Texas, they don't want to talk about it. They have 128 refineries going into just the one bay and the rivers around it. So, you know, it varies widely from country to country.
Okay, thank you. We've got Vic and followed by Dave after. Go ahead, Vic.
Well, thank you. And I thank, first of all, Paul, for the presentation. But by way of background, I joined the federal government, or was recruited from the Ontario government, Ontario Water Resources Commission, in '71 when it was formed, Department of the Environment. And I remember in those early years, the Stockholm Conference was on everybody's mind. And it was on everybody's mind in the context that one of the real problems in the world was there was no political focus for environment anywhere. So UNEP got formed, as you observed, Paul, but so did Environment Canada, created the Environment Department in 1971. EPA was created in '71 in the run-up to that. And now, you know, so that was one of the major outcomes of that, in my view. And then by way of background, I was the alternate head of delegation for the Earth Summit, UNCED, in 1992, and the 2-year preparatory phase, along with the external affairs. And I won't get into a lot of the detail about that, but you know, it sort of was a bridge from the Stockholm Conference. And I'll get into that in more detail when I get the presentation on the 29th about this, the linkage between all of these events and where it's taken us and what we need to do. But for those that maybe think disparaging about Rio was a 2-year process, preparatory process. It had prep comms, they were called, that were 6 weeks long. And I was in Vienna, I was in in the US, and you know, at the UN Center, all of these things. And it was Morris Strong again that was leading this process. And I and you know, the other head of the delegation that met, and even John Charest, who was ultimately head of delegation at UNCED for the formal end of it anyway, that, you know, had many meetings with Morris Strong. He was an exceptional fellow. Yes, maybe he had some things in his background that weren't too nice, but don't we all, you know? Anyway, I want to thank again, Paul, and I just want to say that when I give a presentation on the 29th, I'm going to start with the Stockholm, but only in the overview, how it relates to UNCED. What were the lessons learned? What were the messages received? How has it affected us? How's the ethics that results from these things? You know, what's been the change? Anyway, just leave it to you. You want to make any observations, please do.
feel free to contact me directly in advance if you want to pick my brain on anything.
Okay, thank you, Paul.
All right, Dave, do you want to go next?
Just a quick comment. I actually have Malthus's book sitting beside my bed, and every once in a while I pick it up. It's a awfully depressing book to try to read, in part because it's very difficult English, old style, very hard to fathom. However, essentially, well over 100 years ago, the guy said, look, population gets controlled by famine, pestilence, and conflict, unless we choose to control our own population through family planning. And this was from what could easily be considered as a very conservative religious man, right? He was a reverend. But it leads me to think that this first conference happened, I don't know, 50 years ago almost. And what really has happened in the interim? Well, we doubled the population, we quadrupled the economy, we made a lot of our pollution problems considerably more dire than they were. Certainly it's true, I haven't seen a purple river recently. The last one I saw was in Pakistan in the mid-90s. And I haven't heard of a river catching fire, but I don't know that we're a whole lot better off than we were.
Well, we can go back. As a chemical engineer, I learned that water seeks its own level, and one way or the other, the planet will take care of itself, and some of it may not be very nice.
Yeah. Well, I noted from, on that last chart that you showed that came out of the Meadows book, food supply was much closer to the population line on the increase. And you could argue that it was really showing they expected that peak to be around 2030. And after the peak, the food supply was far away from the population graph, from the line. And that seems to me to point out that we're going to have an awful lot of dead people. It's true, the population is going to fall by half, but almost all those people are going to be hungry.
All right.
One of the things relative to Rio, and I wouldn't mean to offend anybody from a religious point of view, but my understanding at the time was that the Catholic Church would not participate or support the conference if there was any focus whatsoever on birth control or family planning, which was very unfortunate, frankly.
Okay. Madam Fellow, you had a comment?
Yes. My comment is on this issue of population and food and women. I mean, we know, as Anitra said, that when you educate women and they have security in their lives, you have less population growth. And the woman here is the metaphor for if we had greater equality in the world, where if people had not just education as in a certificate, as Anitra knows, we are working here to deal with the quality of education that liberates the spirit, the human spirit. Because at the end of the day, human beings can know a lot, but if their mindset is not amenable to change, knowledge alone is not going to make the change. And so we need to remember that. Second thing is this issue about food and starvation has to be looked at also alongside food and wastage, because so much food is wasted in our globe. And so again, it speaks to patterns of human behavior and mindsets. Because to have a world where some are starving and some have got more than they need and throw away, it's a world that is out of balance, out of kilter with what really matters. And I'm hoping that this COVID-19, because it's an equal opportunity virus, it doesn't care who you are, whether you're king, prime minister, president, and whether you're a denialist or whatever, it goes. That we will begin to look at what really matters in life, which is our relationships as human beings and our relationships to Mother Nature, which keeps us going. And that's really the lesson.
COVID-19 may, in the end, hopefully prove to have been a blessing in disguise. How do we know?
Okay, our next comment is from Mary. Go ahead, Mary.
This is a question for Paul. I've had the privilege of working with Paul on local action for a few decades now. And Paul, I can say publicly in front of the people here that Stockholm did change you, and you brought it into everything you did when I have been working with you on the environment and climate change, et cetera, and sustainable development. I would love to hear, as you think back the last 58 years since that conference, is there any one thing that comes to you now as to why we did not meet the fourth objective of that conference? And that was to mobilize against the degradation of the environment. I think some people would think we're in a worse mess today than 58 years ago. But what is that one thing as you've lived through it?
That's a tough question, but I don't think there is one thing other than self-interest and greed and whatever have you of a variety of people. So it's very hard to mobilize that many billions of people, even at the senior levels, to do the things that need to be done and make things happen. On an incremental basis, there have been a lot of wonderful things happen. Like I mentioned the Hamilton Harbor. I think the Hamilton Harbor has been very well cleaned up. That happened quite a few years ago. I think it's in pretty good shape now, as far as I know. When I was there, it was a sewer. So, but to really move the whole of human race to where it needs to go is, I guess the one thing I've heard said many times is, in the end, nature bats last. And so nature and the good Lord it'll go where it's going to go, and we'll work our way around the edges. We'll do a lot of good stuff, but in the end, I can't see that there's a single reason, as you asked for, and who knows where it's going to end. None of us will be here when it does.
Okay,
Thank you.
our next question comment is from Roland. Go ahead, Roland.
Yeah, Paul, thank you very much for this expose. Very interesting. In Rio in '92, they came with sustainable development and the concept of common but differentiated, and I insist on differentiated responsibilities. What was the atmosphere and the differences between what was called at that time developing and developed countries? Were those differences noticeable, and does that explain that the World Conference switched the name from environment only in '72 to development and to sustainable development in '92?
Well, I think the sustainable development term was hatched with our common future in '87. And of course, then it received a lot of attention in Rio. I think the communications among people and nations has improved dramatically over that 58 years. I think there's been a real attempt made to have developing nations work more closely with developed nations. There are a lot of charities in the world that work very hard at helping the less developed nations who have overcome poverty and so on. But once again, there is no simple answer to a very, very complex question. I don't know if that helps answer your
No,
question.
if I may clarify, and this is maybe a caricature, and I would like to read Mamfella on the comment that I'm going to make. What about the story that the developing countries, and we see this exacerbating in Brazil, where the comment is, you have cut your forests, you have put a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere, and now you are asking us to do the same efforts as you have to do. So there is a differentiated responsibility. We should have different attitudes. And as long as we in Europe or in the States consume 5-10 times more than in Africa, obviously it's going to be difficult to find common solutions.
Well, you're absolutely right. If somebody had the common solution, they would implement it.
All right, our next comment is from Ted Manning, going to be followed by Peter and Susha. Go ahead, Ted.
Okay, well, I'm going to follow the last one. I'm not going to go with the question which I had, which is just a fact that Stockholm was a catalyst to create departments of environment in governments and in universities. In fact, most of them trace back to there. During Brundtland and the World Conservation Strategy, I was the director of sustainable development with Environment Canada, and sort of saw it from its evil inside, because by and large, it was seen, these were seen as events rather than building blocks. And in fact, at one point, when I was in charge of the aftermath of the World Conservation Strategy, our delegation came back, and we were ordered by our ADM to not answer any letters, to take the people off it. We were out of it. The event was over. The photo op has been had. And that was about as blatant as I've seen it done. Most of the other conferences, whether it's Rio, whether it was the later stuff in Johannesburg and so on, have had the same effect. People have been really eager to participate, to write stuff, to be sponsored, to go there. And they come home, and often they're not even given a chance to debrief because their jobs ended. We're on to the next thing because there's no photo op for the minister. So we are really valuing the short term, and this is really what we're all about in all of this, is trying to get people to actually consider implications and impacts over the long term. And this is very much an uphill climb.
That's very good points you make. Several of the consulting pieces of work I did for Environment Canada and Industry Canada, I put a lot of time and effort into them, and I think did good work. And in some cases they got implemented, but then the government would change, or somebody restructure the departments, and all that effort just went down the drain, and you're right back to where you were.
Maybe that's our one reason.
All right, let's move on now to Peter Menke.
Hi, thanks again for a very interesting presentation. I think my question was actually asked. I was just going to ask you if you had any ideas about why things didn't happen as much as they should have after that. But I'll take the time actually just to share with you some readings I've been doing. There's a lot of work going on now about the hunter-gatherer societies and the degree to which they integrated with the environment and society, or with the environment, and really achieved, in a sense, sustainable development, and why those things disappeared. And one of the theories that I find quite interesting was that with the advent of agricultural techniques, we talk a lot about the Industrial Revolution, but with the agricultural techniques that led to the formation of surpluses. And once you had surpluses, you had people who decided that they really needed to control those surpluses. And then that led to, of course, more greed, and eventually to the idea of a hierarchy of control, etc. I'm finding a lot of this is quite fascinating, and I think there may be some lessons that we can look to. I have been fascinated with the problem of scale since way, way back in the 70s. And I think one of the questions that we have to ask is, what is the right size? 2 comments. Thank you.
Any comment, Paul?
No, I think he just, you know,
All right.
asked the right question and saying what is true.
All right. Our next question is from Susha Man. Susha, go ahead.
Paul, very good presentation. Thanks. Now, the green revolution you mentioned, I can relate that with, I grew up in India, and the water and soil in North India, particularly in Punjab and surrounding area, is poisoned. And India is now surplus with the food, but the chaos it has created in the soil, water, and farmers' life is really devastating everyone. Now, I don't know how it is doing in Canada, because we must be using similar weed killer and chemical fertilizer. And I was swimming in Ottawa River with a colleague of mine in the last week, and I did not see much marine life even in Ottawa River while swimming there. So that's one question, how we are tackling that. Just on the equation of surplus food feeding, and population of India was 400 million when I was growing up, and now it's over 1300. And there's hardly a place for people to walk and bicycle. That's one question. The other question I had is, population explosion. We are having some problem with political leaders working against to control population. I remember seeing on BBC that Turkish president opposed Muslim women practicing family planning, but nobody is talking about it, whether in a public life, United Nations, or in our religious places. Nobody is talking, is bringing this issue to the forefront. Thank you.
Those are very good points. If I believe that the Canadian number is something like 1.7 in terms of our Canadian-born women having children. So if you just, as one of our guests said, if women get educated, that's a big move in terms of managing population. They get educated and are self-independent and able to make their own way if they need to. I just find it difficult why there isn't more attention paid to the population issue. But if we put it this way, if every woman who has any children had about 2.4, then the whole world would reach a steady state population.
All right, let's move on. Vic, you had a comment.
Yes, I did. I want to come back to what Paul had said, is what is the reason why industry hasn't moved forward on environmental measures at the rate into the...
I can't hear Vic.
I'm sorry, I'll try to speak louder. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, I said I wanted to come back to this, the reason why industry hasn't moved rapidly on this issue. And the reason historically has been that environmental protection has always been seen as a cost factor and the rate of return on investment equation. And the difficulty here is trying to convince people that there can be no long-term long-term sustainable industry sector without preserving the environment upon which it's predicated. And to give you just a couple of examples of how this has interfered along the way, I went with Mustafa Tolba, the head of the United Nations Environment Program. He asked me to attend the World Trade Organization with him because they were getting opposition when we tried to produce the Montreal Protocol that was going to prohibit chemicals that destroy the ozone layer. Okay? And so the head of the WTO said, we cannot allow you folks to introduce global regulations, all right, to control chlorofluorocarbons and other hazardous chemicals. It's going to be an artificial barrier to trade. It's going to disrupt economies. My reply to him is, so you'd rather have instead an artificial barrier to environmental protection that puts the whole planet at risk? And you know, another one, Charles Cassie and I met with the oil patch trying to get lead out of gasoline, and they kept saying, oh, we can't do that. It's going to cost us so much money. It's going to cost us so much money. So I said, let's go back a ways. Back in, I can't remember exact year, but oil was about $2.15 a barrel or something, and then the Arabs come in with OPEC, and it shot up to $15. And I said, look, you could absorb that cost. How many liters of gasoline do you produce a year? You know, and because the question is, when you remove lead, you've got to leave some of the ingredients in there to keep the octane up. And the difficulty comes is they had a side product where those chemicals would earn more money, those side chemicals. And so, you know, we had that discussion, and Charles Cassier basically stood up and said, I'm out of here. You guys don't waste my time. He's talking to OPEC. And he said, don't waste my time unless you've got some rational arguments, you know? So this is a long time, and it's the whole spectrum is still in that mire. Look at mining in Canada. You know, we do open pit mines. As soon as they don't become economically viable, we abandon them. So whether it's 4 years of mining, 5 years, but we leave a mess behind. And quite often, no obligation to clean it up. So it really comes down to really the economics of these things and linking economic viability to environmental preservation. And that's where the linking has not been made well enough, in my view. And this is where ethics comes in, because the chemical manufacturers, after Bhopal had about turn, they realized after, you know, that Union Carbide killed so many Indians, 3,500, Shusha would know better than I, 4,000 people in that town. You know, then all of a sudden they realized, oh boy, you know, we have some ethical responsibilities that we have to address. Anyway, just some observations on those points.
Paul, do you have any comment?
Oh, he covered a lot of ground there. It's very hard to say other than in general, I agree with everything he said.
I just want to make a comment that it's certainly been my experience that whenever you want to make any change of any type, it's going to be more expensive and we can't afford it. It's like we are at the ideal economic point in our lives right now. Change nothing. So there's always resistance. Let's move on now. Jeff, you had a Mary, pardon me, Mary, you're next. Oh, she's.
Yes, this is a question to everybody. I just wondered if you think this present global pandemic is helping the planet take care of itself. This came up a few times, and my personal feeling is yes, but I'd be interested in a few specifics if people feel this is the ultimate opportunity and it's planet taking the lead.
Well, I'd like to make a comment on that, Mary. I think if you look at that blue sky these days, there's no question that the cutback in the use of fossil fuels has made the sky a lot clearer. It also may be part of the thing that's contributing to this heat wave, because without the pollutants in the air, the sun may be heating the planet more than it traditionally does with the pollutants in the air. That said, I think that this COVID-19 event is causing a lot of rethinking and will drive a lot of rethinking that will be positive in the long run on a variety of fronts.
Okay, let's go to Jeff. Go ahead.
Thanks, Art. Just a couple of observations based on a few things other people have said. I think Mary asked the question, why isn't it all happening? And Peter Menke and Paul, you both mentioned greed, and I'd have to agree with that. Plus the fact that there's just too darn many of us. So we need to do something about population control. The best thing I could have done as a parent probably was try to convince my children not to have children of their own. And instead now I have 6 grandchildren. So I'm not doing much on the contribution front with respect to global population. In terms of COVID being a blessing in disguise, you hear a lot about a green recovery. And I'm interested that the Liberal government seems to want to tie some of its recovery funding, maybe all of its recovery funding, infrastructure funding, to its policy objectives, which I think is a good thing. Basically, for example, this is not necessarily anything to do with funding infrastructure projects, but the federal government was lobbied heavily by big oil not to increase the scheduled carbon tax on April 1st from $20 a ton to $30 a ton, but they went ahead and increased it anyway, and I think that was a good move, and I'm glad they stuck to their policy guns. So maybe in the sense of COVID being a blessing in disguise, it will lead to a green recovery as long as governments can stick to their policy objectives where they exist. I'd also like to just support the comments made by a couple of early on in the conversation about the need for education. I think a very good friend of mine, he's recently retired, but worked for UNICEF, and his whole theme is education, education, education. And I think this is absolutely critical in terms of moving forward. I guess the last comment I'd like to make is, I think we need to, and I'd be happy, Art, to put together a slide on this, but follow the money. And the money is increasingly diversifying away from fossil fuels. You probably saw a few months ago that Moody's downgraded Alberta's credit rating from AAA to AA+. Sweden's central bank sold off all of its government Alberta bonds because they have too large a climate footprint. The government of the Bank of Canada has warned about stranded oil and gas assets resulting from a shift to a clean economy. Mark Carney, who used to be the governor of the Bank of England, now working for the UN on climate change, said that firms that align their business models to a transition to net zero carbon will be rewarded, and those that fail to adapt will cease to exist. The Queen, I just saw 2 or 3 days ago that her financial advisor has said that by the end of 2021, they're going to reduce their investments in oil sands, tar sands, oil and gas, and coal by 25%. So stopping investing in fossil fuels. And it just goes on and on and on. So if you just look at where the money is going, I think that there's some encouragement that we can take from that.
Paul, any comment?
No, I just agree with the comments that are being made. It's very interesting to have seen the stock market recovery. I was convinced that we were starting on a dead cat bounce, so I've been very careful, but the high-tech industry, the money flowing into that, and of course, here we are sitting looking at each other on these computers. Nobody had to get in a car to get here for this meeting, and if a few years ago, we all would have got in our cars, gone downtown, and showed up at the same place. So things are changing, hopefully for the better.
All right, so we seem to have lost Ted Manning, but next one would be Rob Hoffman. Go ahead, Rob.
Hi, everybody. I would like to draw your attention to 2 books, both published within the last couple of months, that go to the issue of governance. And one can argue that in some sense, our major failures have been failures in governance. Clearly, we failed to deal with the climate change issue. And I guess I would argue in response to Mary's comment that we are witnessing a major failure of governance with respect to the virus. I won't go into the argument. But anyway, the two books that go to this issue of governance and how to fix it, which is telling. One is called The Hidden Power of Systems Thinking, Governance in a Climate Emergency. The book's written by actually a friend of mine, Ray Eisen, who has been, he's a systems thinker at the Open University in the UK. He's been president and active in both the ISSS and the American Society for Cybernetics. So that gives you an idea where that's coming from. The second book, and even in a sense more powerful and interesting, is by a Club of Rome member by the name of Ezekiel Dror. The book that he has just published after, so he says, 2 years of almost seclusion in writing the book, is called Steering Human Evolution, 18 Theses on Homo sapiens. The one anecdote I can share about Dror's book is he says, kind of tongue-in-cheek, that our species displayed a certain amount of hubris in calling itself Homo sapiens. What he argues is that we should have called ourselves Homo creator, that what separates our species from many or most is our creativity. But we lack the sapience or the wisdom to channel the creativity in such a way that it meets the basic human needs. I'll leave it at that. Anybody interested in those references, I'd be happy to email them to you, or I can put them in the chat window, but they're apt just to disappear there.
All right, we can move on to John Hollins.
Rob, I'm like you. I've stopped calling our species Homo sapiens. I substitute another term, which comes from an English zoologist from about 50 years ago, who wrote a whole book describing, if you want to understand how our species behave, be really good idea to look at some of the other 100 primates on this planet and watch what they do and how they behave. And you can understand aggression very easily that way. So I prefer his title, which is Naked Ape. We're the only one of the 100 that doesn't have an almost full coat of fur. So that's my contribution to that little bit. Now, I sense a great depth of distress and almost agony amongst this group, faced with the story that Paul has told us. And I've known Paul for 15 years, and he does smile sometimes, but not when he's on this topic.
I was smiling most of the time today.
Thank you, Paul. Got it going. Okay. Now, I was steered into physics and biophysics as a student, and it was only after I got into policy work that I realized that I would have done much better off to go into anthropology or social science or something like that. And it appears to me, Art, that and Dave for Jean, we don't have I'm not sure if we have a political. We have all kinds of disciplines in the membership of KCOR, but what we're talking about is what I expect I was, and I expect almost all of you were basically indoctrinated into the merits of democracy. Winston Churchill put it that democracy is the worst form of government except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. But I frankly played in the political process on the margins quite a bit. I think it would be really useful if we had one or two talks by political scientists who have a clear feel for ecological, environmental issues. So that's just a suggestion to you, Art, and to Jean Doherty, our program manager.
Let me respond to that. If someone was to step forward, we will find a spot and give them some Zoom time. Absolutely. Okay, Dave, you got a comment? Dave Doherty?
Yeah, sure. I was listening to, that's Jane who just showed up in the background. I was listening to people talking about education, and I think they're correct. But I also think it's really important that what it is we teach matters. I mean, they're in the process all over North America in particular, kind of coming out of Texas, as far as I can understand it. No, I think it's Texas, rewriting textbooks that we use in our high schools. And I know that they adopted this in Alberta. You can't get a Canadian textbook there now. They all come out of the United States. And they all come out of Texas, and they're all teaching just stuff that I would say we should not be teaching. If it involves superstition, if it involves discrimination, for example, against women, if it involves so-called facts for which we have no evidence, like, oh, the earth is flat, then we should not teach it. So you can't just say education. Because right now in Alberta, they're in the middle of trying to get rid of public education.
I will say this, agreeing with Dave, as a paleontologist and a biologist, one of the things that we had happen to us was that when we went out to the schools, we were no longer allowed to use the word evolution without talking about God's creation as well. There were many times when I was giving speeches or talks to school children where I basically had to explain to the teacher that I was going to use the words that were appropriate, not the ones that were dictated to be politically correct.
Okay, thank you. Paul,
Where was that? Which
that was in Ottawa.
In Ottawa.
One was in Ottawa, the other was in Alberta back in the 1980s, or late 80s, early 90s. I had many circumstances where this happened, but those are the two that stuck in my mind, where I was told by the person in charge of the students to be careful what I said.
So have things gotten worse or better since the 90s?
In many cases, they've gotten worse because many people obeyed those kinds of dictates, and many of the teachers don't really understand what they're talking about. Like, especially when there was, similar to the climate deniers, there were the creation scientists. You know, there's creation science. No, what did they call it? Creation science. And they called it a science, and it's not science. You cannot test a belief. You can only test things that you can see. So it doesn't follow scientific method. It doesn't follow any of those things, but it's a belief system. It's a belief structure that's been indoctrinated through a religious group.
Okay, let's move on. Anitra, you had a comment?
No, I wanted to thank Paul on behalf of USACOR, of whom members come and go. And I'm sure Mamfella, if she was still here, but she isn't, would like to thank Art for putting this all together, and KCOR for letting we strangers from alien planets into rich and piquant discussion where everybody has a different view, but somehow they all merge at the end. So thank you all.
Okay, thank you, Anitra. You're always welcome to any of these, and anyone in USACOR, by all means. The invitation is standing. We have Peter Menke.
Oh, just one quick, I highly recommend the book Humankind. There's some mention about looking at apes and gorillas and so on. This is a really very, very complete analysis of what we are.
Okay, Nigel, I can't see that you're here. You must have left. And so if there's no more formal questions, what I'm going to do now is stop the recording.